Hello, everyone. This is Afrometrics research-based news, just giving you an update on the major research publications of this past week that are relevant to the Black world. This week, we will be discussing the Asian model minority stereotype and its relationship to anti-Black attitudes, racial discrimination, and its relationship to mental health and personality characteristics. We will also discuss the impact of building an oil pipeline structures in Uganda, factors that predict fatal police shootings, and ethnic differences in the aging of hair. There's an ongoing federal lawsuit called Students for Fair Admissions versus Howard University, and it puts Asian Americans at the forefront of the current battle over affirmative action. In this legal case, Harvard has been accused of holding Asian American applicants to a higher standard than applicants from other racially underrepresented backgrounds, such as Black and Latinx Americans, and manipulating aspects of its admissions process to discriminate against Asian Americans. In light of this, two authors, Jacqueline Yee and Nathan Todd, they recently published a paper entitled Internalized Model Minority Myth Among Asian Americans, Links to Anti-Black Attitudes and Opposition to Affirmative Action, and is published in the Journal of Cultural Diversity and Ethnic Minority Psychology. The model minority myth is a popular phrase that represents the stereotype that Asian Americans are intelligent, industrious, and dutiful. Now, although those beliefs are positive values, when Asian Americans internalize these beliefs about themselves, that internalization is associated with negative psychological outcomes for Asian Americans. So the authors of this study surveyed a group of East, South, and Southeast Asians for their model minority attitudes, which is whether or not they have internalized these attitudes about themselves as Asian Americans, and the relationship between having those attitudes about themselves as Asian Americans and having anti-Black attitudes and attitudes toward affirmative action, for or against affirmative actions. And they found that the more Asian Americans internalize the model minority myth, particularly in the achievement orientation, the belief that they're more achievement oriented than other racial groups, the more likely they were to hold anti-Black attitudes. So in the author's words, when Asian Americans believed that their racial group was more academically and economically successful because of their stronger values and achievement and hard work compared to other races, they were also more likely to believe that Black Americans did not possess such attitudes and therefore were less successful. They were also more likely to oppose affirmative action policies when they held those model minority myth beliefs. So this research has direct implications for therapists and social justice leaders and those who are referred to as equity advocates who want to target the factors that lead to anti-Black attitudes, one of them being internalization of this model minority myth among Asian Americans. Also, a new study was published in the Journal of Clinical Psychological Science. It was conducted by Yara Makawi, Cortland Hyatt, Jessica Maples Keller, Sierra Carter, Vasiliki Michopoulos, and Abigail Powers. So, although a great deal is already known about the experience of racial discrimination and how it's associated with psychological distress for the targets of racial discrimination and other poor mental health outcomes in general, there has been some doubt cast on the association and an attempt to explain it as being the result of negative emotionality, meaning that racial discrimination may be positively associated with psychological distress in people who have personality traits such as impulsiveness, neuroticism, and people who are already easily irritable and easily upset. That the suggestion being that racial discrimination leads to negative outcomes for people who have these particular personality characteristics. So these authors studied a sample of African Americans to determine whether racial discrimination explained the variation or the differences in depression, anxiety, and post traumatic stress symptoms beyond the role of personality traits that some doubters have used to explain the relationship between experiencing racism and psychological distress. So their investigation found that the experience of racial discrimination affected depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress independent of personality characteristics or personality traits, meaning personality traits do not fully explain the relationship between racial discrimination and negative mental health outcomes, which further supports the validity of the detrimental impact of racial discrimination on the mental health of African Americans and the importance of nurturing in African Americans, particularly African American children, a strong sense of racial and ethnic identity because it is a protective factor against psychological distress. Also, a new study was published in the Journal of Energy Research and Social Science. It was written by Tom Ogwang and Frank Von Clay. The purpose of the study was to investigate the impact of building an oil pipeline in Uganda, actually from Uganda to Tanzania, but they studied the impact of building this pipeline, particularly in Uganda. So, oil was discovered in Uganda in 2006, and much is already known about the potential impact and benefits for industries and for the economic growth rates of countries when countries discover oil. However, discovery of oil and the building of pipelines also associated with disruption and calamity. So Ogwang and Von Clay conducted a case study investigation of the social impacts of building the East African crude oil pipeline, the EACOP, in Uganda. So they used a multi-methods approach, including 86 in-depth interviews, focus group discussions, participant observations, and document analysis. And they found that the route planning and the land acquisition for the pipeline, it had created environmental and social impacts that included: one, physical displacement due to the fact that they needed to acquire people's houses and land; two, resettlement; three, economic displacement because people's livelihoods were disrupted from land acquisition; four, disputed valuations for land that was acquired because home and land owners felt that they were not consulted enough; also, delayed compensation for acquired land. Another negative impact was livelihood disruption. Another was food insecurity because crops couldn't be planted. And also uncertainty, fear, and anxiety due to the project delays that were taking place. The likely benefits of the project included employment opportunities, although these were mostly short term. Other benefits included improved infrastructure and accessibility because new roads, airports, and refineries needed to be built. And lastly, oil revenue to the nation. So a major issue in the Ugandan project has been the delays to the project, which have been exacerbated. A major issue in the Ugandan project has been delays to the project, which have increased or made worse the anxiety and livelihood impacts. But this study gives some really up close insight into the impact of oil pipeline projects and the impact that building that infrastructure has on the African continent. Investigators at Boston University recently conducted a study to identify the factors that best predict fatal police shootings of Black victims at the site of police incident. They analyzed incidents at the level of census tract city. A quote from the researchers from Boston University reads, "We find that higher levels of concentrated disadvantage and interpersonal firearm violence in a census tract are significant predictors of the likelihood of any fatal police shooting occurring in that tract. We also find that conditional upon fatal police shootings having occurred in a census tract, knowing that the victim was unarmed is a significant predictor of the likelihood that that victim was Black." Three other predictors of police shooting victims being Black were a higher proportion of Black residents in a census tract, a greater presence of police officers in the city, and a higher level of Black-white residential segregation in a state. We conclude that reducing excessive police use of deadly force requires consideration of not only the individual's interactions between officers and citizens, but also the quantity of interactions and the characteristics of the place in which these interactions occur. So in circumstances where the victim is shot while being unarmed, the victim is more likely to be Black. Again, they find that residential segregation and concentration of police increase the likelihood of fatal police shootings of unarmed Black people in particular. So this study's research suggests that to reduce police use of excessive force, structural racism has to be addressed in the form of racial discrimination and over-policing in Black neighborhoods, and also concentration of income and wealth disadvantage. Lastly, a new study was published on hair aging in different races and ethnicities, and it was published in the Journal of Clinical and Aesthetic Dermatology. Now, the study was written and conducted by several authors, including Mayara Maimoun, Melissa Laughter, Samara Pollock, Iman Khan, Thais Marquez, Rana Abdat, Lynn Goldberg, and Neelam Vashi. So these authors study ethnic differences in hair aging for many reasons. One, populations are aging and becoming more diverse, which is making it more important to understand diverse hair aging processes. Also, differences in hair aging provide information that may aid in culturally sensitive approaches to health and recommendations. So the authors reviewed over 69 publications on ethnic differences in hair aging between 1965 and 2019. There were many findings, including the finding that hair graying onset varies by race. For example, the average age for Caucasians being mid-30s, that for Asians being late 30s, and that for Africans being the mid-40s. They found differences in where hair damage occurs in hair follicles. Caucasians and Asians typically experience damage to the distal hair shaft, while African Americans see damage occurring closer to the hair root. As far as the specific findings, and I have to say that a lot of the language in this study is very technical, and instead of paraphrasing it in my own words, I am going to use the technical language of the authors, because I'm not a hair technician or stylist, but I think that those who are may appreciate the language better, and I don't want to compromise the meaning. So as far as the ethnic specific findings, they found that African hair has an average diameter of 55 millimeters, the smallest among all hair subgroups. Furthermore, African hair contains the greatest variability in diameter in a single strand, as well as the fact that it is ellipsoid and flattened when compared with hair affiliated with other racial ancestries. Regardless of race, however, the larger the diameter of the hair fiber, the faster the rate of hair growth. And although there are no differences in the hair growth cycle among Asian, African, and Caucasian hair groups, African hair has been found to grow at a slower rate, likely due to its smaller diameter fibers. African hair is relatively fragile and thin, comparatively speaking, as evidenced by the smaller number of cuticle cell layers and smaller diameter, and the longitudinal splitting of the hair shaft with minimal stress. In addition, virgin African hair, which is hair that is not undergone any chemical or thermal treatment, has less tensile strength than Caucasian and Asian hair. And then the authors go into some cultural considerations. Hair is of cultural value for women and men of African ancestry. Multiple hair products, thermal and chemical treatments, and hairstyling practices are used particularly for African and Afro-textured hair. With age, hair is seen to become thinner and the scalp has a lower density of follicles. Certain factors contribute to the hair loss, and people of African ancestry, alopecia is the sixth most common diagnosis made when visiting the dermatologist. Unique hairstyles such as cornrows, tight hair ties, braiding, and weaves common among individuals with African hair of African ancestry create traction on the scalp and can produce traction alopecia. Furthermore, as African hair has tight coiling, everyday washing, combing, grooming practices increases knot formation and leads to a high prevalence of fractures along the hair's length. And it's common for African hair to be treated with heat colorants and chemical relaxers in order to attain a more quote-unquote manageable style. These chemicals alter the chemical and morphological properties of the hair shaft, leading to the cleavage of disulfide bonds, the formation of cross links, and changes in keratin protein conformation. So studies like this are interesting interesting and increasingly important to both physical and mental well-being. Populations are aging and becoming more ethnically diverse in their demographic concentrations. So that's why this study was included this week. Thank you, everybody. This has been an Afrometrics research-based news brief. You can visit us at afrometrics.org. See you all next week.